In October 2024, at the height of the presidential campaign, evangelical pastors started referring to Vice President Kamala Harris as a Jezebel. They did not mean it as a compliment. Christians routinely point to the Old Testament queen as a figure of evil.
But while Jezebel is a name that gets thrown around a lot, who exactly was Jezebel? Where did all these stereotypes come from? That's what we're going to discuss on this episode of the podcast.
Welcome to Glad You Asked, where we answer the questions about Catholicism that are easy to ask but not so easy to answer. Emily, how are you today?
Hi, Rebecca. I am still recovering from finding out at 10 a.m. that my son didn't have a lunch in his lunchbox and having to drive the 20 minutes to school to drop it off. So that's thrown off the day, but I'm excited to be here.
I do not miss those days. My kids are old enough so they can pack their own lunches now. Good times.
How about you? How are you?
I'm all right. It's raining. It's muddy. I feel like I need to go out and scrub the mud off of the animals because they keep rolling in it. And as soon as I clean them, they roll in it again.
Little like Sisyphus.
Yes.
So diving into the topic of today, we're talking about Jezebel.
Yeah, when I was little, my family had this Bible comic book from the 70s. I actually still have a copy. I got it for my kids because I thought it was so much fun. I wanted to reread it again. Everyone in the book looks like movie stars. The guys have these amazing mustaches. Everyone's in bright colors. And Jezebel's kind of a main baddie in the Old Testament section. She's persecuting Elijah and trying to make everyone worship the god Baal. But I always thought she was kind of cool. She had these awesome earrings, great clothes. She's kind of calling the shots.
So I'm not sure that's maybe how she's portrayed all the time in popular culture, but Christian tradition definitely has painted her as a supervillain. There are some feminist movements that have tried to subvert this. One obvious example is the feminist website Jezebel, which has been around for nearly 20 years.
So today's guest is going to talk to us about the biblical figure of Jezebel, who she really was, why she's been used to attack women, especially Black women. I'm Rebecca Bratton Weiss, one of your hosts for the Glad You Asked podcast.
And I'm Emily Santa. Before we get into the interview, though, a word from our sponsor. Glad You Asked is sponsored by the Claretian Missionaries. The USA-Canada province of the Claretian Missionaries tends to the religious and pastoral needs of vulnerable communities. As part of a global congregation of Catholic priests and brothers, Claretians uplift the dignity of all people, especially those who feel overlooked or forgotten. To find out more and get involved, please visit www.claretians.org.
Today we're talking to Stacy Davis, professor of religious studies and theology at St. Mary's College, Notre Dame, Indiana.
Davis is the author of Haggai and Malachi in the Wisdom Commentary series, an associate editor of the Africana Bible, Reading Israel's Scripture from Africa and the African Diaspora, and for the forthcoming Westminster John Knox Bible.
For more information about Davis's scholarship, take a look at the show notes for this episode. In the following conversation, we talk to Davis about the Old Testament figure of Jezebel and how she's been used as a weapon against women, especially Black women.
Hi, Stacy. How are you today?
Good. How are you?
Good, thanks.
So you've written about women in the Old Testament for a scholarly audience, but also for a more popular audience. You wrote about Jezebel for the site Bible Odyssey. Can you talk a little bit about your background?
I am a Hebrew Bible scholar by training, and I taught at St. Mary's College in Notre Dame, Indiana for 21 years, and I am now an academic acquisitions editor at Westminster John Knox Press.
So just to start us off with our conversation today, what do we know about Jezebel? What does the Bible say about who she was?
According to 1 and 2 Kings, Jezebel was the wife of King Ahab of Israel, and she was from Sidon, which is now in present-day Lebanon. And from the biblical perspective, it's important that she worshipped Baal. And so the Bible describes her basically as a bad influence because she worshipped this other deity and then got her husband Ahab to follow her lead. The prophet Elijah gets involved, kills her prophets after this power play about which God can make fire. And then Jezebel gets in her feelings and actively works to have him killed. So while Elijah is trying to avoid death, Jezebel has a man named Naboth killed so that the king can turn his vineyard into a vegetable garden in 1 Kings 21. And Elijah, who manages to come out from under his death threat, basically says, and I quote in 1 Kings 21:23, the dogs shall eat Jezebel within the bounds of Jezreel, end quote. And then the narrative aside, a couple of verses later is, quote, indeed, there was no one like Ahab who sold himself to do what was evil in the sight of the Lord, urged on by his wife Jezebel, end quote. And so in 2 Kings 9, that prophecy is fulfilled when King Jehu gets the assistance of a few eunuchs to throw Jezebel out of a window so that the dogs can eat her. And scene.
So obviously, the Bible has her cast as kind of a supervillain. Oh, historically, do we know anything about her? And was she really as bad as people seem to assume she was today?
Pretty much the only real evidence that we have is what we have in the biblical text. And that is going to make Jezebel bad primarily because she worships another deity. That would have been enough to have branded her as the worst woman ever. Historically, as someone who was from Lebanon, it would have made sense for her to worship Baal. So, what is missing pretty much from the biblical story is Jezebel's perspective, because as a non Israelite, as someone from Sidon, she's worshiping the God that makes sense to her. Regarding the unfortunate killing of Naboth, she sees her husband kind of pouting about this vineyard and decides to take action to give it to him. This action does include getting people to lie against Naboth and basically stone him to death, which is a bit of a power play move. It's a bit gangster, but it's more serious, I think, in a historical context than the worship of other deities would have been. Because the Hebrew Bible does not have a lot of tolerance for religious diversity, that alone would have been enough to get Jezebel on the ancient Hebrew Bible equivalent of a blacklist.
I know we're going to talk about stereotypes about Jezebel, but just before we do, I just want to say that I think people who aren't familiar with the story just think that she's like this figure who shows up and she's wearing a lot of makeup and she's but like she actually did a lot. Like she was kind of kick ass, right? Like she had power, she did stuff.
Yeah.
Like I don't think many people know how like detailed or long drawn out the story of her is.
Yeah, I mean, in the story of Naboth the Vineyard, it says that, she wrote letters in the king's name and sealed them with his seal, right? She has a lot of initiative. The whole makeup situation does not happen until right before she dies. So she had a whole long makeup free life before that happened.
Yeah, so kind of going off that, what stereotypes do we have about Jezebel today? And then how did we kind of get from the biblical story that you just said to kind of modern day stereotypes?
The main stereotype we have is basically her death scene in 2 Kings 9. In verse 30, it says, and I quote, Jezebel painted her eyes and adorned her head before being thrown to her death. That she basically dresses up and kind of, tells Yehu, oh, you're the one, who's going to murder your master, right? So we're not sure if she makes herself physically attractive and enticing as a way perhaps to avoid getting thrown out of the window. But at minimum, we already know that from the biblical perspective, she had demonstrated her ability to be enticing by leading Ahab into idolatry. So the stereotype is a combination of two things: her beauty and then her ability, according to the biblical text, to manipulate men. So it gets her the label basically of whore, not because of her sexual behavior, but because of her beauty and an already existing biblical metaphor that portrays any worship of another deity as sexual unfaithfulness. And that stereotype has a much longer history in prophetic literature. It starts with Hosea, it shows up in Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Malachi, in which unfaithful Israel is personified basically as a cheating wife. So Jezebel becomes the whore extraordinary, and the fact that she's beautiful just adds to it.
I find this interesting because there's other passages in the Hebrew Bible where women put on makeup and dress up in order to be enticing to men, and they end up being heroes like Judith or Esther. It's interesting that Jezebel gets in trouble for it. Is that because, as you say, because she's worshiping a different god?
Absolutely. Judith is worshiping, the one the correct God of Israel. So she's able to dress herself up and cut off somebody's head. Um Esther, who is also faithful, is able to use her beauty as a way to save her people. Because Jezebel is not Israelite, her beauty is seen as a snare in ways that an Israelite woman's beauty would be seen as an advantage.
So, what's the impact of those stereotypes about Jezebel today? Have they influenced ideas about women's roles, and how so?
I think the simplest, most direct impact of those stereotypes is the idea basically of the femme fatale, right? This beautiful woman who's going to be the downfall of that unsuspecting man. So if you read Proverbs 1 to 9, there's always the what is translated as the loose woman who lures a man kind of into illicit sex. The name Jezebel actually also reappears in Revelation chapter 2 as a false prophet that the writer has to warn people against. And so the overarching stereotype is that you cannot trust a woman, especially a woman who is beautiful and or actively makes herself look beautiful. The line that came to me is from a very old R&B song from Belle Biv DeVoe called Poison. And the line is basically never trust a big butt and a smile. And that's pretty much the stereotype. Beware of the good looking woman.
You wrote an entire article titled Jezebel from an African American Perspective for Bible Odyssey. Could you talk a little bit about that article and what the story of Jezebel has to do with Black women?
Because the biblical version of Jezebel is this beautiful foreign woman who can be the downfall of good, upstanding men, that image was used against African American women since at least the 18th century. In a nutshell, the purpose of slave owners having sex with their slaves was to increase their property. But they wanted kind of a rationale for that that wasn't just strictly economic. And so white slave owners would justify their abuse of enslaved women by insisting that black women were Jezebels. They were naturally more promiscuous and tempting than white women. So these poor white men just couldn't help themselves. And so that insistence was linked pretty much to differences in body shape between white women and black women, particularly regarding their breasts and their buttocks, that black women were seen as having much larger um, rear ends and much larger breasts. And so even after emancipation, black women were still presumed to be sexually available to these white men because they just can't control their own sexuality. And that sexualization was even done against basically young women. There are postcards from the US from the early 20th century that show young black girls with prominent buttocks wearing short skirts with exposed shoulders. The one I remember distinctly has a girl sucking on a banana, which is basically an imitation of oral sex. And so while these postcards don't use the term Jezebel, they show the image of a Jezebel as a black girl who was basically promiscuous. And so in black communities, a response to that stereotyping was what Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham coined respectability politics, which was this idea that if you were as demure and as conservative as possible, that you could not only advance economically and socially, but you could also perhaps keep yourself from being attacked. So it was this internal community policing of Black women's bodies and sexuality, everything from dress to hairstyles to manners, as a way to hopefully deflect unwanted male attention and particularly unmale white attention.
So, how about today? How is Jezebel showing up in our popular imagination? Are there different ways? Is she still being used as a kind of weapon to manipulate and dehumanize Black women, women in general? And what does Jezebel in our imagination, what does that show us about how we envision women's roles?
The three things that popped to mind when I saw this question, one, I'm an old movie buff, so I'm going to point out that Betty Davis won the 1939 Best Actress Oscar for her starring role in, you guessed it, Jezebel. And she plays this beautiful and manipulative woman who basically gets her just desserts by being pretty much shot down by a good man that she was trying to play. In the 1989 film Still Magnolias, one of the characters, Annelle, before she starts going to church, is literally called a Jezebel because she was drinking and smoking. Much more recently, in Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, the house of prostitution is called Jezebel's. And so the image is still basically one of slippage, right? Because the biblical Jezebel was a wife. She was not a prostitute. She was not a loose woman. She, for all we know, remained faithful to Ahab the entire time. But the contemporary image of a Jezebel is someone who is more like the loose woman in Proverbs, who is a prostitute, who might lead men astray, who does not keep control of her sexuality in convenient containers. And that image still holds, even if the name doesn't.
So, what do you think about efforts to rehabilitate Jezebel?
I stumbled across Jezebel magazine, and I find that a rather interesting interpretation of the image because it's working actively against the stereotype of Jezebel as oversexed and takes a specifically feminist approach to the name. And since Jezebel definitely was an active agent in the biblical text, she might not have been feminist, but she basically was her own boss. And what I found interesting is that the magazine itself was launched in 2007 by Anna Holmes. It was meant to serve as an alternative to traditional women's publications that showed women without any physical flaws. And so her goal was to have a magazine that showed women in their entire range of beauty, not being photoshopped, not necessarily having their faces made up. But the irony is that Holmes didn't like the title. She didn't want it to be called Jezebel precisely because she remembered, wait a minute, didn't that woman put on a whole lot of makeup and get thrown from a window? And so the name was picked basically kind of against her better judgment. So she knew that stereotype and wasn't quite sure at the beginning whether that could be rehabilitated.
Yeah, it almost seems like, even after talking to you, the main takeaway of the Jezebel story is women can't win, right? Like, we can be good wives, we can get our husbands what they want, we can, you know, there's no winning.
You wanted a vineyard? I got you a vineyard. Wait, what are we talking about, right? But yeah, there was that sense of because she did not handle things, she manipulated the system to get her husband the vineyard. But then, I guess, a little side note, when Elijah prophesies that Ahab is going to suffer for this because he repents, he is allowed to kind of not feel the effects of that. He's allowed to kind of die in as much peace as he's able to get. It's Jezebel that gets thrown out the window, and all that's left is her head and her feet.
Yeah, I keep thinking of all of these other examples of Old Testament women who are doing kind of the same things. Like, doesn't Abigail essentially ditch her husband for David? Um,
Abigail was another boss, right?
yeah.
Because she sees Nabal and is like, this man's going to get us all killed if he does not stop talking. So she has to, gather the loaves and send people out to David, like, please don't kill us. So, yes, she basically realizes this marriage is not going to keep me alive. I've got to turn him loose. Nabal dies. Abigail becomes another wife and actually one of David's trusted advisors.
I'm fascinated by all of these images of women who could potentially be used to kind of counter the Jezebel stereotype. But what are some general ways you would suggest to address this issue of the Jezebel stereotype as being used against Black women, or just this whole idea that a woman's going to be obviously reduced to just her sexuality?
I think for Black women, as I kind of pointed out in the Bible Odyssey article, the natural hair movement and sex positivity movements have been two ways to kind of reclaim Black bodies, both from the sexualized stereotype of older white men and Black respectability politics. I also think that whether you're a Black woman or not, just a woman in general, it's always helpful to remember that the biblical texts themselves were written by particular types of men. And these were men who were very concerned with the nature of otherness, not only in terms of gender, but in terms of ethnicity. So, back to your point, there were women in the Hebrew Bible whose actions get praised precisely because they're Israelite. Because religion was so based in the ancient world on ethnicity, a non Israelite woman was not going to be seen in a positive light unless she converted. And people didn't do that a whole lot back then. Jezebel was Sidonian and a Baal worshiper. She stayed true to herself. Ruth converts, but that's kind of the exception that proves the rule. And even the use of Jezebel in Revelation is basically part of an intra-Jesus follower dispute. And so I'm quoting Lynn R. Huber here, who points out in the Westminster Study Bible, quote, the name functions as a slur, end quote. And so the question is always, how do you reclaim a slur? And I think that minus the unfortunate killing of Naboth, one way to reclaim that slur is to look at really Jezebel's independence and her boss mentality. She's like, I see a problem, I will solve this. The sad thing is she had to spend a whole lot of time propping up Ahab as opposed to just kind of doing her own thing. She might have made an incredible queen in her own right if she had not been from Sidon. She might too could have been an Esther or a Judith.
Do you think that some of the stereotypes resulted from people who were more they were more familiar with the use of her name as a slur in Revelations and less willing to engage with her actual story in the Hebrew Bible?
I think it's probably a bit of both. It didn't help that her prophets got into a fight with Elijah, right? I mean, I'm just being serious about that. Um, you know, because of course we think of our prophets as the highest form of ethical folks in the Hebrew Bible, and her prophets got into a war with them, and Elijah's like, you're feeding these idol worshippers at your table. And then she's like, okay, you killed my people, so now I'm gonna have to try to kill you. It's hard to come back from that type of death threat, but I think if she had been Israelite, she would have been viewed very, very differently. I know I keep stressing this, but I think I'm just going to stress it again. The foreign nature of her identity and her ethnicity works against her as much, if not possibly more so than her gender.
Mm. Well, Stacey, thank you so much for talking to us. This has been really fascinating. I want to go back and reread the story.
Thank you very much for having me.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Emily.
Yeah, so what did you all think? Was there anything that surprised you?
I really appreciated the way she highlighted the fact that Jezebel's really big issue was just that she's getting her husband to worship, the wrong God. And comparing her with some of the other Old Testament women really kind of, I think, showcased that women all over the Old Testament are doing potentially transgressive things, but they're doing it, for their people and for their God. And Jezebel comes along and is doing a lot of the same things, but she's doing it for her God, her tradition.
Okay, also, I'm a little embarrassed to admit this because I've taken many Bible classes in undergraduate and graduate school, but I didn't realize that there's not just one chapter in the Bible about her. Like she is a recurring character throughout First Kings and Second Kings. Like she shows up over and over again. This is a multi-episode long story arc, right? So I mean, I guess it is surprising to me that she just gets limited to this word, the slur, when she is such a big character in the Bible.
Yeah, she's a huge character. And I think, as our conversation highlighted, she shows a lot of agency, which I mean is not unusual for Old Testament women. And it is really interesting that she's just been reduced to this kind of, well, she must have been hypersexual and she must have been seducing the husband she was married to. How dare she?
Yeah, I kept sort of thinking about these stereotypes too about Jezebel and how they still just play out today. I mean, it's unsettling, but not surprising at how persistent those narratives are.
So, kind of switching gears a little bit, was there anything that you wished that Stacey had talked about or that we should have asked her maybe in the moment? Was what questions do you all still have?
One question I have is whether the efforts to rehabilitate or just at least I don't know, get a more accurate representation of some of these characters need to have a certain amount of balance because like Jezebel's still doing some kind of bad things. um like there's some oppression going on of she's encouraging her husband to, kill a guy and take his vineyard. So I think that's kind of something I'm interested in is, where do we find that balance when we rehabilitate these biblical figures?
Why do people in the Bible have to be all good? Right? Like David was not good. Elisha set bearers on teenagers, right? Like,
Right.
they're just I think we get into this idea that, like, we have to portray people in the Bible as, like, moral citizens, like, and they're not always, they're just people.
I'm also curious about like when this sort of shift exactly happened where everyone's associating Jezebel with is synonymous with like wickedness. Like did it become more of a common interpretation at a certain point? I guess the history of the biblical interpretation and how it evolved intrigues me, and like I'd be curious how different her perception was over time.
So one of the things that I wish she talked about a little more was she mentioned Abigail, but didn't really tell the story of who Abigail was. And so I figured a lot of our readers are also not going to be as familiar with who Abigail is. I did look it up and I kind of wrote a summary. I know Rebecca might disagree with my telling of Abigail, and I will let her refute my interpretation, but this is my understanding. So in 1 Samuel 25, David is on the run. King Saul is trying to kill him. He's with this band of men, and they stumble across the estate of this guy named Nabal, who is rich, has thousands of sheep and goats, and Nabal's having a feast. And so David comes in and he's like, me and my men protected you and your shepherds, and we made sure nothing bad happened to you, so you should give us food, which to me sounds very much kind of like the mafia or something, like, we protected you. And Nabal is like, I don't even know who you are. You're some like runaway servant. Please go. And so David, being kind of not a great person, is like, I can't believe this guy didn't give me food. Let's attack him. And so he's, plotting with his soldiers to attack Nabal and Nabal's house. And a servant comes and tells Abigail. And so when one of the servants tells her what happens, Abigail like rushes out, gets this huge supply of food, loads it onto donkeys, doesn't tell her husband what she's doing, and goes out to meet David and his band of roving mercenaries, is what I picture. And then she persuades him not to attack. Is basically like, you're gonna become king. You don't want this on your conscience. Like, it's okay. And David listens because, he's persuaded by this woman who is like patting him on the back and giving him compliments. And Abigail goes home and tells her husband what happened, and Nabal dies. Like, I don't he just dies. He didn't like the news. Um, and then somehow like David is like, "Hey, you're a widow now. Wanna marry me?" So that's what I took away from the story. I felt like Abigail gave in to terrorists, but she did kinda keep her people safe, so I guess she deserves credit on that, but I know, Rebecca, you have a different take on the
Yeah,
story.
I wanna know what Rebecca's take on this is, because that was quite the tale.
So my take, and you know, half my family's Jewish, so King David's kind of a big deal. My take is I totally believe it that he was in fact out there protecting the shepherds because he was a shepherd himself and he came from like a working class background, and that yeah, he's a roving mercenary now, but he's like kind of on the side of the people, whereas Saul is just a jerk. And so this guy is like, yeah, don't bother me now. I'm feasting, I'm rich. And David loses his temper as David does. And I feel like Abigail is like looking at this situation as like, oh my gosh, my idiot husband, who is just sitting here like a slob feasting, isn't going to help out this guy who protected him. And now my all of my people are going to be in trouble. And all right, maybe she was kind of fed up with her husband also, and this was a great opportunity to get one over on him. So I see it as her being very shrewd and kind of getting out ahead of the game to save her people, to placate King David, and then she ends up becoming one of the queens and one of his advisors. Like I like her. I think she's cool.
I think it stems back to you are more pro David than I am, apparently. But I think it speaks to what you were saying, Rebecca, is like there's no good or bad people, right? Like everyone's just people. They have motivations that like we don't know thousands of years later. And like they made complicated decisions. And maybe they don't have to be good or bad
Right.
people because people are complicated.
Yeah, and they're operating in a moral code from 3,000 years ago, which we can absolutely critique, but they're still kind of trapped within that code and trying to do the best that they can.
Anyway, that's our show. Thanks again for joining us for this week's episode of Glad You Asked. If you enjoyed the episode, please tell your friends about the podcast or leave us a review or rating on whatever podcast platform you listen to. It helps more people find our podcast.
Do you have a question you'd like to hear answered on our show? Email us at editors@uscatholic.org. And please join us next week when we'll be discussing whether there are still hermits. Glad You Asked is sponsored by the Claretian Missionaries. The Claretian Summer Mission is for young men and women ages 18 to 30 who feel called to grow in their relationship with God. Inspired by St. Anthony Mary Claret, this experience will equip you for meaningful service while connecting you with a community of faith-driven young adults. Learn more and apply today at www.myclaret.org/Claretian Summer Mission.
Glad You Asked is hosted by me, Emily Sana, along with Rebecca Bratton-Weiss, with assistance by James Chung McKenna. We're produced by Sarah Butler-Schuler, with sound engineering by Nathaniel Hunter and art by Megan Avery.